Welcome back for another Friday Night In. Tonight, we've got a new story for you. We're gonna follow a young boy on his quest for revenge. Mix him and roll him. This is In the Fields. A monster killed my first love in grade school, so I hunted it down. It happened between 1974 and 1975. Over the course of that year, 6 girls went missing from their neighborhoods. This was prior to missing kids appearing on the sides of milk cartons or up-to-the-minute news, so when kids went missing, it took a while for word of mouth and posters to circulate. And even then, most disappearances would be pushed aside and dismissed as a runaway. Our town had a modest population, but was vast in size. Farmland, woods, and lakes surrounded us. We were an industrial town and had a steel engineering plant that employed most of its citizens, either directly or indirectly. That year, there were nationwide strikes going on in the steelworkers' unions. New contracts were proposed and rejected, and the workers walked off the job. Truck delivery blockages and clashes with the police ensued. Neighbors, friends, and family chose sides, which aggravated the situation more. The whole town felt like it was steadily tearing itself apart. And all the while, young girls between 10 and 14 years old were disappearing. And barely anyone was noticing. Then, Anna Roberts was taken. I'd fallen for her the first day of grade 1. She was the kind of girl who immediately draws everyone's attention to her when she enters a room. She was sweet and kind and funny. She quickly became the most liked girl in class. By grade 8, I was hopelessly in love. I never knew how to tell Anna that, of course. I was shy and she was popular, so she never knew. Then, Anna was gone. I remember the morning her seat was empty in class. Then I remember 2 days passed before a cop came to school to talk to anyone who may have information on her whereabouts. It was the town sheriff, Walkley, who did. He was my best friend, Pudge's dad. I remember feeling bad for him. The last year of high tension between his citizens had taken a toll on Walkley, and he looked 10 years older. I'm sure the last thing he wanted to do at the time was investigate another missing girl. Following his visit to our class, he pulled me aside and asked me to talk to the other students and find out anything I could. I agreed and asked him how the investigation was going. In one word, good. In 2 words, not good. There were no signs of struggle at Anna's home. Her room was neat and tidy, nothing missing to indicate a runaway. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no clues, no leads. Walkley left, and I realized they weren't going to find her abductor. And I was right. The investigation hit a wall. Time passed and Anna joined the other 5 forgotten girls in spite of high anxiety and rioting in the streets. But the schools were still buzzing with gossip. Stories floated through our junior high of who or what was committing the abductions. Some kids said it was a criminal who escaped from a nearby mental ward. Others were saying there was a psychotic vagrant who came in on the trains once every 2 months to find his prey. He'd bring the girls' bodies back with him on the trains to be dumped somewhere in the country, which was why they were never found. But the prevailing theory among students was more local. In our town, there was a large cornfield that pushed into it from the south, making a direct route across impossible. You had to cut through the field by foot or drive around it to get from east to west. If you were driving, it wasn't a huge detour, but if you were walking, it could add an hour or 2 to your trip. Still, lots of people cut through it by foot. It was mostly teens and children, but some adults did too. Though, I should say, it was only brave teens, children, and adults who did. Because every time you entered the fields, whatever road you picked could lead you to what the cornfield was most known for. Its scarecrows. There were dozens of them. The owner of the property, Leland Wallace, shifted them around on occasion, giving the impression they were moving on their own. For many of us, this left more than just an impression. But it was also the way he made them, with all kinds of strange nails, splinters, and patches of fur covering them. He painted a bunch of old, dried-out cow skulls black and used them for the heads. Many of the students believed the scarecrows climbed off their posts at night and went looking for girls. When the scarecrows found the girls, they'd tear off their hands and feet and stuff hay into their arms and legs. Then they'd cut their throats and stuff dead crows into their chests. The missing girls were now up on posts, rotting away in the fields, and they were now a part of the scarecrows. One of them, and would go after any girls that entered the fields. No one dared to check the scarecrows to see if any of them were the girls. It was way too scary to even think about. The scarecrow idea was shrugged off by anyone above the 8th grade. It was Santa Claus and Easter Bunny talk, but in our grade, it prevailed. There was a boy named Tommy Jervis who claimed he saw them one night. The story was a little touch and go, as he also stated he was there making out with a girl in the 9th grade, but he did tell it seemingly genuine, with great detail, and for whatever reason, even I felt myself believing him. Tommy told us he and the girl were about 50 yards into the cornfields on a Saturday night around 12:30. They'd just started necking when they heard the wind pick up. The cornstalk swayed, then twigs broke. The two stopped kissing and looked around. The girl screamed, and they realized they'd picked a spot right under a particularly tall and frightening scarecrow. There had been clouds over the moon when they entered the rows, making it extra dark. But with the full moon out now, the looming figure above was revealed. The girl kept saying it wasn't there before. She would have seen it. Tommy wasn't sure, but the wind picked up again. The cornstalks swayed up and down heavily like stormy waves. The scarecrow's arms caught the wind and swung down at them. The girl took off and Tommy followed, but as he did, he looked back and saw the post holding up the scarecrow had fallen over and was now empty. Tommy saw movement down the rows to his left, rushing towards him. It was the scarecrow, plowing through the stalks, screeching out something that sounded like the cause of 1,000 dead crows. Tommy caught up to the girl and pushed her forward the last several feet of the row. They tumbled out of the cornfield and onto normal grass. As they were laying there, Tommy swears he looked back and saw the scarecrow in the darkness of the rows, staring back out at him. But it didn't leave the field. It stayed in the shadows of the stalks, then disappeared back to its post. I didn't know what to believe, so I took any and all views on the disappearances seriously. Everything could help me track down whatever it was that took Anna and the other girls. As frightening or as unlikely as the scarecrow theory was, it was at least something I could make plans to combat against. It was a start. I planned to do it all by myself, but two others joined me. Pudge, my best friend, and Becca, who was Anna's best friend. Becca and Anna did everything together. They dressed similarly, coordinated the same color hair ribbons, and had matching pink woven bracelets with yellow butterflies on them. After Anna went missing, Becca looked like she'd lost a part of her, and it was replaced by something angry and filled with rage. Something I knew too well. I approached Becca 2 weeks after the disappearance and told her I wanted to do something about Anna, about all the girls. What was going on had to stop, and the police force was too hamstrung with the union strikes to put any real time in. So it had to be us. Becca was in before I finished my pre-planned and rehearsed proposition to her, and she proved to be cunning and resourceful. She also had access and experience with her father's guns. Her dad was a heavy collector. Becca snagged a Smith & Wesson .38 6-shooter with a 4-inch barrel for herself. It was small enough for her to carry and conceal, and she'd shot it several times and knew the minimal kickback well. Becca gave me a Remington 870 pump action. She'd snuck it out of her dad's collection with 30 shells and told me to bike out to the quarry on the outskirts and practice. She met me there and showed me how to hold it to avoid the butt kicking back and hurting my shoulder. My aim improved, and we added movement to my target practice, with a Coke bottle swinging from a string attached to a high branch above. It was a good exercise. It got me following the target, finding its movement, entering a flow state, and predicting its back and forth motion. I wasn't bad. Becca was a perfect shot every time. We knew these weapons might not work if we were, in fact, facing something more supernatural, but the three of us had agreed the scarecrow idea was less likely, so we set out to disprove it. Pudge managed to get us some supplies, a set of walkie-talkies from the station, and several jerry cans of gasoline, which were in case bullets weren't enough. Becca wanted revenge more than I did. If it was the scarecrows, she wouldn't have hesitated to burn the entire field down. In her mind, it'd be worth it for Anna's memory. So we had motivation and weapons and supplies. Then came the plan and the other utility Becca offered, which was herself. Becca volunteered to be used as bait to draw our targets out. She was on the track team and could run for days. Though we weren't sure about who the abductors were, Becca had used her clout in school and asked around every grade. In the end, we had good authority that each one of the girls had gone missing in the fields, so at the very least, we were fishing in the right pond. We started off by mapping out the general locations of the scarecrows in the field. We knew Leland moved them occasionally, but it was never much further than 10 or 20 feet. Corn is planted in rows, so we created a grid and sectioned it into 4 quarters. Each quarter had between 15 and 20 scarecrows set up in random placements. They were all tacked onto 18-foot tall posts. Since the corn was between 7 and 9 feet in height, the eyesores stood high above us. It took a full weekend, but we got them all drawn on the grid. Most of the scarecrows were at the center of the bottom right quadrant. This fit with our plan perfectly, as that portion of the cornfield ended with a forest. This helped in case of the possibility we were dealing with something or someone other than the scarecrows that weren't bound by the field's perimeter. 100 yards into the woods, we dug a hole 12 feet deep and filled the bottom with sharpened sticks and branches that spiked up dangerously. We left the large bear trap uncovered in case anyone stumbled upon that part of the forest, but we built a loose cover for it out of leaves and loose twigs and branches for when we were ready to use it. We were going to send Becca into the cornfields at night. She'd take one of the walkies with her. We taped down the PTT button so it broadcast everything that was happening to her as she carried it. Pudge and I had the other walkie at the edge of the cornfield, listening in, shotgun in my hands and an axe in his. We also had the jerry cans of gasoline and 2 large whiskey bottles fashioned into Molotov cocktails. Becca carried one as well, but hers was a beer bottle with a bandana crammed in its mouth. She taped a Zippo lighter to the neck of the bottle, making it quicker to ignite. All she'd need to do is flick the flint wheel and a spark would catch. She wasn't fucking around. Becca would walk along the end rows whistling innocently, moving at the same pace and perpendicular to Pudge and I outside the field. She'd come across multiple scarecrows on her path. After checking each one, she'd radio back they were all just old clothes and hay. If any climbed down off their posts and attacked her, Becca would get into a foot chase with them, knowing full well the paths to take to bring her to the forest. With any luck, the scarecrows would follow her but not be able to leave the field. This is where we could blow them apart or set fire to them. If it wasn't scarecrows and they followed her out of the fields, they'd fall into our trap, impaling themselves on the spikes. Then we'd set them on fire at the bottom of the pit, and after they'd burned up, we'd fill it back in with dirt. Whatever was abducting those girls, if it was happening in the fields, we were ready for them. After all the prep work we did on weekends, we spent every Friday and Saturday night in the rows dangling our bait. Weeks passed. Nothing was happening. We tried branching out further into the grid, hitting new batches of scarecrows and adjusting our routes. But still, the weeks came and went without incident in the fields. Not only that, but it had been 3 months since Anna had gone missing. That was the longest stretch between girls. We started wondering if whatever had been happening with the disappearances was over. If we'd missed our chance at revenge. Or were we warding it off? Pudge was the first of us to throw in the towel. He was tired of spending his weekend nights out in the rows and didn't think whatever had been out there was still a threat. Pudge wasn't a huge loss himself, but he needed the walkies back as well, so that put an end to our weekend patrols. We all decided to do one more Saturday night, one last attempt to get our revenge. Of course, Pudge backed out at the last minute, so it was just me and Becca. Since this had started, Becca and I spent hours together in the cornfields and the quarry. We talked on the phone and met up at diners and the town movie theater. It felt like all of that was coming to an end now. We met up at 10:30 on the Saturday night and walked down to the cornfields together. This time when she entered the rows, she talked to me through the radio. She told me about Anna, about playing sports and taking classes with her, bike rides and swimming, how good of a friend she'd been. It felt like a eulogy. It was beautiful, and Becca began to cry. I decided we were done for the night, and we were done holding on to what we were doing. Whatever it was had stopped and we needed to move on. I went into the cornfields planning to tell Becca a new truth, which was that I was falling in love with her, and then I was going to kiss her. But just as I was approaching her, a heavy beam of light shot through the corn stalks, highlighting Becca between the rows. I ducked down as a man's voice yelled out. It was older, filled with authority, and it was familiar. It asked who was out there. With the light on her, Becca yelled out, identifying herself. The voice yelled back, approaching her. It was Sheriff Walkley. He asked if Becca was okay and if she was alone, and just as he did, I stepped backwards, snapping a cornstalk. Walkley called out to me and shined his flashlight. I left my Remington hidden in the rows, revealed myself, and joined the two. Walkley looked exhausted. The Union strikes had taken up all his time and energy, and now tonight was his one quiet one, and there'd been a call about some high schoolers out drinking in the cornfield. He couldn't find any, but stumbled upon Becca and me. He offered us a ride home in his cruiser. We declined, saying we were happy to walk back, but he insisted. We followed him back through the corn rows to the road where the sheriff's car was parked. I got in the front seat with him, and Becca got in the back. As he drove, Walkley developed a nervous air about him. I noticed him looking at Becca in his rearview mirror repeatedly. I think she did too. It was quickly apparent he wasn't headed in the direction of either of our homes, but he chimed in that he had to stop at the old nickel mine in the south end of town to pick up a generator he'd left there. Walkley asked us what we were doing out at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, and if our parents knew we weren't home. If anyone knew we weren't home. Without thinking, I'd answered that my mom knew. Walkley chuckled and said he doubted that. He continued driving, and I was wishing more and more that I'd refused the lift offer and pushed for us to walk home. After 10 minutes of driving and the town lights fading behind us, we pulled into the old nickel mine parking lot. Walkley got out and told me to come with him. He needed my help, then told Becca to stay in the car. I felt really nervous by that point. I told him I hurt my arm earlier and wouldn't be much help. Walkley stared at me through the windshield and said, "Get out." I couldn't move. I was too scared. Walkley got angry and marched over to my door. He opened it and grabbed me by the arm, yanking me out of the car. He slammed the door and dragged me towards the mine entrance. As he pulled me, I heard one of the car doors slam behind us. I don't know where it came from, but a strange instinct took over and caused me to jump to the side. A gunshot roared out, then a second one. I tumbled, but got my balance and looked back to see Becca with her .38 pointed at a now toppled over Walkley. She'd caught him with both shots. The first hit him in the cheek, just below his right eye, which was now entirely red and sunken in. The second shot hit him in the neck, which was generating a considerable flow of blood out onto the ground. Becca walked over to Walkley and fired the remaining 4 shots into him. I got up and joined Becca. She lifted her left hand, revealing a dirt and blood-stained pink woven bracelet with yellow butterflies. It contrasted with the bright and clean one that was on her own wrist. Halfway into the drive to the mine, Becca had found Anna's bracelet where she was sitting in Walkley's cruiser. It was crammed between a floor mat and the back seat. She didn't want to shoot him while he was driving and potentially cause a crash. She'd been biding her time, waiting for the safest and clearest shot. With the revelation that it was my best friend's father and the town sheriff who was responsible for what was happening, Becca and I needed to decide what the next steps were. Our immediate reaction was to call it in, reveal that it was the sheriff who'd been taking the girls, destroy Pudge's life, throw the last bit of gasoline on the town to send it into a full-blown bonfire. I'm a firm believer that anything that can be destroyed by the truth should be destroyed by the truth, that the chips should fall where they do. But back then, in that moment, we decided to hide it. My dad had taken me driving a few times, so we packed Walkley's body into the cruiser, and I drove it to the bear pit we dug. Becca and I dumped the body inside and filled it in. We left the sheriff's cruiser in an abandoned lot, and I walked Becca home. It wasn't perfect. There wasn't a perfect option. It was all a trade-off. We knew the town would be better off not knowing. But Pudge, would he fare better in the future, wondering what happened to his dad? or knowing exactly what happened to him and why. We decided leaving Pudge with empty hope for his dad's return was the best option. At least he'd still view his father as a good man, even though he wasn't. Becca and I assumed the girls' bodies were somewhere down in the mine, shoved in a crevice or hidden in some chamber, but it was too dangerous for us to check. We waited a few months, then made an anonymous call to the new sheriff that there were bodies in the mine. A week later, Anna's body was discovered in the mine, as were the 5 other girls. Closure finally came to the families, and to Becca and I, but not Pudge. He fell heavily into depression, and his mother moved them to another state to live with relatives. Becca and I started dating. We stayed together through college, got married shortly after, and are still together to this day. And that concludes episode 43. We hope you enjoyed In the Fields, and we'll see you back here next week with a new story that tackles some familiar elements of Lovecraft and cosmic horror, following a PhD student who volunteers for a confidential university experiment. We'll see you next Friday.